Okay, so getting ready to try and transition towards a democracy or democratic republic. So the reality is that when you go from a republic to when you go from a what is essentially, I mean, Cherokee to an extent has a republic. It's not a true republic; it's more of an oligarchy. Um, so you have the syndicate, which is a number of representatives in the oligarchy. You have the monetarists, which are the oligarchy. Then you have the extremely wealthy sultanate, sultana, whatever part is called, which is like one person. And all of this forms the oligarchy of the extremely rich. So, or I guess it's more of an aristocracy than anything, because you have the extremely wealthy elite. The unfortunate reality is that going from a wealthy elite running everything to going to something that is more of a republic requires you to essentially have a decent amount of wealth spread along far more people. So instead of having just a handful of extremely wealthy, like crime syndicates and monetarists and this, you need like a lot of wealthy houses. You need a lot of great houses. Um, let's see. We can take Rome as an example. So yeah, when we look at the Roman Republic, like they had 300 senators most of the time. And then under Julius Caesar, it rose to like 600, and then it increased to 600 as the Roman Empire grew, as the Roman Republic grew. And then under Julius Caesar, it rose to just under 900. Well, it rose to 900. So we're not talking a small number of people. We're talking you have a massive number of great houses. Granted, Roman political office. One of the reasons it spread so much was they probably had representational in all of their taken holdings, and there were senators from all their holdings. So there would have been senators from Britannia. There would have been senators from. I think Rome took parts of took large parts of Africa. So there would have been holdings in Africa and Italy. Well, obviously Italy and Greece, all over the place. And what was then known as Gaul, when they conquered that, there would have been holdings. So lots and lots and lots of senators. And you need that for a republic because you want to split up uh, the control. So if we look at the US, we have like what? Like over 100 or so? Yeah. We have two from every state. There's what, like 52 states in the Union in the US? Somewhere around there. And we have like a few others to represent like special interests, I think. So like we don't have that many senators, but we then have the House, which uh, is more based on population. So if we then turn and look at that, how many? Let's see. There's 435 representatives. So all in all, our Congress has it has over 500, has over 500 people. So we're not talking a small transition of power here. You're going from an aristocracy where essentially only the strong and the hyper wealthy rule, and the Sultana instead wants to transition to some sort of republic. Granted, republics aren't necessarily democracies. Keep that in mind. The U.S. uses a democratic republic, but it's still a republic system. A true democracy doesn't really work once you get over, what is it, like 500 people, 50 people? Yeah, true democracies don't work with scale, but republics can work with scale, and democratic republics can sort of offset the issues. But you end up with different problems with democratic republics. So every system of government has its own problems. Okay, so she's got quite the road ahead, because in order to not just turn her fledgling republic when she does it, if she does it, in order for her to not just change that to be essentially just the same thing as it is right now, just under a different name, what she effectively needs to do is help to create many, 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 many other groups that are on par with the Syndicate and the Monetarists, even if that means dragging down the Syndicate and the Monetarists, and potentially even herself in wealth and power, to create these new entities that are specifically independent and have no major loyalties to any group. So that's kind of where the problem is. Otherwise, let's say it's the Monetarists, they could very easily just say, well, we'll get them all under our group, and then now the Monetarists just have more power. They have more votes. The other problem that can show up is a problem that the US had. So when you have a republic, if people are allowed to leave that republic, then you have typically them taking them and their territories and potentially just seceding and forming their own country, which you then either have to, coax them back into joining you or invade them, which is what the US did with the Confederacy. We won't go into that or why any of that happened, but they did legally secede, and they became their own legal country. And due to various things, some of which are emphasized by basically one political party in the US emphasizes one, usually race, and the other political party in the US emphasizes economy. And one of these, I suspect, was what sold the justification of the war to the people, and one of them was the actual reason. And there was probably more than just one of the, I mean, both of them came into play, but yeah, whenever you have any kind of conflict, any kind of war, there's the rationale that you give to the people, and then there's the rationale that is actually the justification for it. So we'll take what would even be called the Americano-Talibani War, Afghanistani War, where the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to take out the Taliban. Well, we didn't really invade them. We sort of did. We, I think we'll just call it an invasion. We did move in and we started slaughtering them. Basically, you can think about that as what was the. Let's go with Iraq. That one's a bit easier. So, what was the stated justification for the war in Iraq? To find weapons of mass destruction. The actual reason, because as it turned out, we all knew that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There was no evidence of that. We were fully aware that they didn't exist, but it was the justification which we used to go to war. So, with that in mind, what is the actual justification? Probably oil, probably money. Saddam Hussein was a jackal that we used to try and take down Iran at one point in the 80s after the fall of the Shah. So, and that jackal had gained political power and he had then turned on the US. So we were getting rid of a jackal. So, I mean, there were lots of other more important reasons. And the search for WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, may have been important, but it's more of a combination of all of these things. But if you go and you tell the people, yeah, the reason we're after this guy is because we helped put him in power, we helped him, send essentially children to their deaths in the war against the Shah, and we kind of our smoke and mirrors and Black Ops basically just ended up with him turning on us and failing at the job we had for him. So we need to get rid of him because he's basically becoming a we'll say a less than an anti-American state. Well, you tell people that they now start to get suspicious of the government. It doesn't really work too well. So you just have to tell them whatever you think will make them happy. So, if we look at the Civil War era, American northern industry had been built on the tariffs, money built on the money gained from tariffs and taxes, from exporting all that cotton from the South through New York City. That's why there are so many factories in New York City and New York State. When all that a fun little fact about that era is New York actually wanted to secede with the South. So Texas didn't really care. Texas just wanted to stay with the North. But they sort of looked at the South, and then they looked at Mexico, and Mexico's like, hey, remember when you had your little rebellion and then very quickly joined the Union so we wouldn't just jump you again? Yeah, stay with the Union. Be. Do it. So, kind of how that works. Texas didn't really care about that entire, non-slavery, slavery. Like, Texas wasn't interested in that whole debate. They were just like, whatever, do your thing, leave us alone. By the way, I grew up in Texas. And Texas is hilarious because it talks about, because whenever you learn about the Mexican, whenever you hear about the Texican rebellion against Mexico to become Texas, it's usually presented in this more positive way. The reality is that at almost every single turn, the Texan rebels were getting curb stomped by Mexican forces. Like, just absolutely just annihilated. They weren't being annihilated. They were being beaten on a fairly regular basis and, taken prisoner. And, nuns and priests were helping them to escape and all this good stuff. And so there's this whole thing that ended the Texican rebellion against Mexico, which is they captured good old Santa Ana. And this is always brought up as this sneak attack that just so happened to, and Santa Ana was a coward and ran away from the battle and blah 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 blah. The reality is most likely that the Texans decided to have one big last battle against the Mexican army, because they knew that very soon they were going to have the manpower to even resist the Mexican army as it was coming for them. So they just sort of gave it their best. They went up there fully expecting to be exterminated and to not really be able to do anything against the Mexican army after that. and do this big sneak attack essentially when they're in their siesta, try and kill a bunch of people, and as their big last hurrah in the war. And then Santa Anna decided to run away from his troops and get captured. If that hadn't happened, there's a good chance Texas would still be part of Mexico. But, he ran away, and they managed to get him to agree to, like, what was it, like a 6 months or year treaty? And so he's like, okay, fine, we will recognize you as your own state, as your own country, and there's a treaty, a non-aggression. There's a peace treaty between us for 6 months to a year, whatever it was. And we'll see you after that. So the Mexicans were getting ready to just invade Texas with this massive army and just kill everybody, probably. They were most likely just going to go for total war and just exterminate the entire population and then introduce their own population in. And then Texas, knowing this is going to happen, is like, USA, how do we join? We'll give you whatever you want. Like, terrified knowing what's going to happen. So, they had to do all this stuff, and then they were able to join. And Mexico, with this huge army, was just like, well, why don't we just go take Texas back then? So then you have the Mexican-American War. But, like Civil War, a lot of people on the left side of our economic system, they like to say that the Civil War was just, fought over racism. I think that was the justification that was sold to the American people. The actual justification is probably more economic. Because I mean, like, people were still enslaved in, like, Mexico, most likely. Why didn't we liberate them instead? So, and then no real protections were given, like, afterwards. Like, there were people post-Civil War, like, there were African-American people of African-American descent, and, African-Americans in the U.S. post-Civil War who essentially signed contracts with their former owners that were so unequal in contracts and basically were binding generationally that these people essentially went from being literal slaves to being slaves, basically. Like, when being generationally enslaved to these people, just again, but now economically and legally for the time period. So it's one of those things where justification sold to the people for conflict is almost never actually the real reason why. If we take the Russo-Ukrainian War, Russia sold the idea that the Ukrainians were all Nazis, and that is why they were invading to, like, basically liberate everyone. But in reality, Putin just wanted to take land. He doesn't care about the people. He just wants land. He wants power. So he wants a freshwater port. So those kinds of things. Again, but you have the justification that's sold to the people, then you have the actual justification. These very well may be the exact same thing, but very, very often they are not. So just be skeptical of your government whenever they start trying to sell a war to you. And the reason they do this, by the way, just so we're absolutely clear, when you go to sell a war to a government, I mean to the people, you have to have a relatively high approval rate of that war. So, if I remember correctly, like, I think at the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War, like, Russia had like 80% or something approval rate of going to war with the Ukrainians. and that was already considered like low. That was already considered dangerous. Um, let's see. Today, the Russian-Ukrainian war is supported by 75% of the population. It was much higher previously. And by the time you're getting to like 75%, that's already dangerous territory. Like you already have rebellions happening in Russia from the Russo-Ukrainian war already. You have like there's one commander who's recently like rebelled essentially. There was that PMC that rebelled. I think it was Wagner. So if you're ever wondering why Belarus didn't join the war, it's because their approval rate was like 5% for them joining the war against Ukraine. So if 75% is already, you start having rebellions. It's probably closer to like, I don't know, 70, 60% by now. Maybe lower. But when it already starts getting like below 60% to 60%, below 80%, like you're already running the risk of having rebellions just start up even in your own military, even with your own mercenaries. So it's just one of those things. If it's 5%, yeah, right, you'll send your military out and then you'll have an uprising. So it just is a thing. So anyway, yeah, Nanamo is going to have a hell of a time transitioning from monarchy with oligarchy to republic. It's probably going to take her somewhere in the realm of 400 years if we gauge the so the Emancipation Proclamation. It was in England. Um, wasn't their Bill of Rights Magna Carta? That's what it was. The Magna Carta issued in 1215, and what that did was it reduced the power of the king and by reducing the power of the king, yeah, so it reduced the power of the king and it gave more power to the nobles, the aristocracy. This is generally considered as England's first steps towards democracy. So, with the limitation of the king's power, the king was sort of like the most powerful of the nobles with their military. So, with the limiting of that, limiting the king's power, you now had power more distributed. And if you don't know how dictatorships in monarchies work, is pretty much almost all the power is consolidated in the kingdom, in the king itself, in the monarchy. You have the king up here, then you have the nobles, the nobility down here, and they are all subservient to the king. If the king wants, he could execute any one of them. Magna Carta gives them more rights. The other thing that's most important is that usually the king or the monarchy's army is strong enough to take on any other house, at least, usually multiple houses. And then there's also the politics of it. Like, who's going to side with, what group within, say, a civil war to get rid of a house. So if you want to learn more about that, look up the War of the Roses. This was an event where, when did the War of Roses happen? It's what Game of Thrones is based on to an extent. War of Roses was 1455 to 1487. So how this works is, I believe, one heir to the throne of the monarchy was supported by one group, another was supported by a different group, and you basically just had this massive civil war between these two, like, huge coalitions that were now slaughtering each other to try and put their successor on the throne, essentially. So, good old War of Roses. What did you say? In what way? But yeah, the monarchy is just how that works. But you have two successors, that would be the War of the Roses. So, kind of a big thing. This happens pretty regularly with monarchies whenever there's a war of succession. So, we had the Magna Carta around 400 years. Oh, it was just some spammer. It was just some spammer. Don't worry about him. So, War of the Roses. So Magna Carta. This power is being distributed more amongst the people, more amongst the nobility. You're going from monarchy to aristocracy. And then from aristocracy, eventually enough yeomen or freemen gain power, and enough merchants gain power, that you go from strict aristocracy down to having more of an oligarchy, where a lot of guilds have power, a lot of more common people have power instead of those who are highborn. And then eventually what ends up happening is there's a large enough merchant class that they essentially begin forming their own, that they essentially gain political influence. And so after that point, you essentially start running into things where basically the aristocracy starts running out of money because they can't really compete with the merchants anymore. And so there was this thing that happened. It happened in Japan. It also happened I think it happens in almost every feudal country, is that essentially the merchants gain enough power that they start loaning money to the aristocrats, because the aristocrats are now just running out of money. And eventually what ends up happening is the aristocrats, their debts get called, they can't pay them, and they essentially just become puppets of the merchants, political puppets. And so at that point, the aristocracy is kind of dead. It's kind of just on life support while the merchants are using them for power. And then eventually, usually the monarchy loses all power and is either completely dissolved, like it was in France. France was rather violently, but it would happen sort of like Spain. I think Spain they don't have a monarchy anymore. And you start seeing, and once this starts happening in one closed nation, it usually starts to domino effect across a lot of other nations, which is why other nations throughout history have gone to war to reinstate monarchies. It's just easier to do it that way for the other monarchies. But yeah, it's definitely something that is really important. So the merchants gain power. The aristocrats, in essence, they still exist, but they're not aristocrats anymore. They essentially just become part of the merchant class, but they're usually so well connected politically that they're able to leverage that to then stay hyper wealthy. Like the United States has the Kennedy's family, it has the Koch brother, the Koch family, has a lot of these hyper wealthy the 1% of the 1%ers that, you know, these are the people who would walk into a store that has like 3,000, like $300,000 leather jackets, and they just buy it, you know, stuff like that. These are the kind of people we're talking about. You know, $100,000 suits, $1,000,000 suits, driving around in Ferraris and Bentleys. Elon Musk could you could say Elon Musk is a version of this. He was a version that was in South Africa. Now that South Africa has done its whole like wealth redistribution thing, he's probably, I believe he's fled that country entirely. But yeah, I mean, these are the examples. Now, this all leads you to a republic, to a democratic republic, which is what Nanamo wants to do. So, or which I think they're like trying to like talk about doing. I don't know if she's actually going to do it. So, Nanamoshi creates this republic. Magna Carta took 400 years to where you had an actual democracy or democratic republic start to show up. And then, so that's the 1600s. It takes until the 1700s, like 100 years later, for the French Revolution to happen. I think that was 1700, right? I think it was 1700s, 17 or 1800s. I think it was 1700s. And so they basically do away with their monarchy entirely. Things had already been sort of moving in that direction, but they've exterminated their monarchy, and you have the Reign of Terror. Then you have eventually the U.S. A lot of countries were flipping over to democracies, democratic republics at that time. And so then you have the U.S., which essentially was just a grand experiment in a lot of ways. They finally get their democracy off the ground, 17 something, 1779 or something, 1792, whatever it was. And so 1776? I don't know. I don't remember. So that all takes over. I know we've been talking like for almost 30 minutes about countries, political systems, and stuff like that because of Nanamo. So, okay, we have that point. And then eventually, like, by the time you get to Harry Ford in like 1920s, when a lot of the workers' rights and privileges and protections sort of come into play, like then you have what most people would consider like a proper democracy in the US, proper democratic republic. At that point, that's more for the people instead of just like our extremely wealthy class. You can argue it still is, but so that's like 1920. So Magna Carta is like 1270 something. We essentially getting to where like things are stable and actually good for workers is like 1920. So a little under 700 years passed between the Magna Carta and you having what people would consider a stable, working, good democracy. You can rein it back a couple hundred years if you want for like the actual like beginnings, but we're still talking like Nanamo thinks this is going to be something that happens within her lifetime. This is not going to happen within her lifetime. She will not be the last in her line. If her plan takes off, it won't happen in her lifetime. It'll take many, many, many generations of her life, depending on how long Lalafels live, for her to even come anywhere close to success. Anywhere even close. She can set the groundwork, but all it takes is for, like, essentially, like, her descendants, if she doesn't just die, to, like, come in and basically just reconsolidate power, and then all that's undone. So, and that's more commonly what happens. But, you know, there are steps that she could take to make it happen, to help things along. But, you know, it is what it is. But all right, so in order to move forward in this, we need to do the Naval Hard and the Howling Eye Hard. But I am going to go eat lunch first. So I will see you all next time, everyone. Have a good night, everyone. Or a good day.